So we've upgraded Drupal, we've upgraded all of our modules, we've made sure that our content and our content types and our content fields have all survived the upgrade. We've also seen that our comments survived the jump, as did our URL aliases. There are just a few more things we need to do to get our site back to how it was before we began the upgrade process. Let's start by going to people. We see that we do have the same two users. However, they don't have any roles. If we go to edit one or the other, there are no options for roles for us to assign to them. This sometimes happens during the upgrade process, and most often it happens because you actually didn't create any custom roles in Drupal 6. The administrator was sort of an inherent special role given to user 1 on the site, so we didn't technically have a real role for the user 1. And we didn't create any special roles for this user. This was simply an authenticated user, which just means he's not anonymous. To fix this, let's go to permissions. And we see here where we can start playing around with permissions. We can also click here to look at the user settings page. And here, where administrator role usually is, we don't have any other option except for disabled. Let's go back up. Let's go back to where we were. Let's click on roles here. We see here that we only have the anonymous and authenticated user roles. Locked doesn't mean we can't use them. That simply means we can't delete them. These are inherent roles that Drupal provides, and things would get really screwed up if we were somehow able to delete them. We do, however, want to edit the permissions. This is something you need to do on any Drupal site, whether it's a new site or a migrated site, because things can get a little bit weird, and anonymous users can be granted permissions you don't necessarily want them to have. Even permissions with security ramifications. Let's scroll down here. We do want to allow them to view comments. We scroll down a little bit more. Use a filtered text format. Let's go ahead. We don't need this on our site. There's no reason to allow that, even though they can't edit or create any content anyway, but it's probably safest just to go ahead and turn that off. We do want to allow them to view published content, of course. We scroll down a little bit more. Most of this is administrative stuff, which we obviously don't want them to have access to. We will allow them to view user profiles. Down here, we see that anonymous users have the ability to bypass views access control. In other words, if we make a view and allow it to be accessed only by certain roles, anonymous users can bypass those access restrictions, basically giving us no reason to have access restrictions to views in the first place. We obviously want to get rid of that. So let's save our permissions. And really the fastest way, that was an example, but the fastest way to make sure all your permissions are good are just to go to the main permissions page and look at anonymous user and authenticated user. We'll come back to this in just a minute. First, we need to go back and address the problem of there not being any roles. Now, this is simply an authenticated user. That's not really a real role, so we're not going to worry about that. But we do want our administrator to have the administrative role, which currently doesn't exist. If you install Drupal 7 from scratch, it will give you an administrative role. But when we migrated from 6 to 7, it just keeps the roles that we had, which basically were none. So we're going to manually create the administrative role right now. Let's go back to permissions, then roles, and we're going to add a role. This will be administrator. And instead of editing that role directly, let's go back to the main permissions page, so that way we can make sure that our authenticated users, which we haven't edited yet, we can do that at the same time. So administrators, we basically want to give them access to everything. We want them all, obviously all administrative access, and there's basically nothing that you want an administrator to not have. Here we see that authenticated users have a few more rights than anonymous users. They can post comments and skip comment approval, that's just fine. Once again, everything for administrators we're going to enable, unless we wanted to restrict them from using full HTML for whatever reason. Just going to go down here and tick everything. Of course, they should be allowed to bypass content access control, obviously administer content. Some privileges are given to them automatically. We'll go ahead and say authenticated users can view own unpublished content, even though we're not really going to have a case for that on our site. And we're just going to go down here and let them do anything in panels or in articles, events, pages. We, of course, already had these abilities as the sort of grandfathered in version of user 1, but if we want to create any more administrators later, we'll need to have these permissions in place. And also, we'd like to give ourselves the proper role of administrator, just to make the back end a little bit more clear on the site. We're going to give them panel node access, panels itself. This is kind of a tedious process, but it's an important one that you need to take care of. Of course, we want them to administer path settings and path auto settings, stylizer if we ever use that, modules of course, site configuration, themes, software updates, use the site in maintenance mode. That's obviously going to be very important. We don't want to lock our administrators out of the site when we're in maintenance mode. That's when we need them the most. We'll let authenticated users view user profiles just like anonymous users can. Now, we should have everything selected for administrators. That seems to be the case. But we want to, almost missed that, take views access away the ability to bypass views access control from authenticated users. Save our permissions. Now if we go to roles, we'll see anonymous user, authenticated user, and administrator. Let's go back to the list of people. We still need to manually give ourselves the administrator role. And now we have that ability. Notice authenticated user is automatically checked. We can't do anything about that. Authenticated simply means they have been created on the site. Now we're going to save that. And also, if we go back to the permissions page and click on this user settings link, we can now set the administrator role to administrator, and that's what we're going to do. And we're going to save that configuration. And now we have our list of users, our roles, and permissions set up for the site.